Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this webinar on how to prepare for EUDR obligations, practical solutions to comply with the law. We're hosted today by Sourcemap's Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs, Marissa Brock. Thanks for kicking us off, Marissa, as well as a panel of experts from Ernst & Young. We're joined by Zeron Tran, Partner for Operating Model Effectiveness, EMEA, Alberto Zampala, Partner and Head of Digital Sustainability Solutions, and Stefan Geiger, Partner and Head Advisory for Climate Change and Sustainability Services, Switzerland. Thanks everybody for being with us. We're going to begin with short presentations from each of our panelists, where we will walk you through an overview of the forthcoming EUDR deforestation regulation, including what due diligence is required and who is impacted by obligations under the law. We'll follow with some practical solutions to comply with the law based on what we've seen in the market and our experience working across industries. We'll then transition to a roundtable discussion to dive deeper into both the interpretation of the law as well as some challenges companies are facing as they prepare. That session will be about 35 minutes after the presentation. For those folks in the audience, we'll open it up to a short Q&A towards the end of the panel. In order to submit a question to the queue, please utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we have time for. I'll hand it back over to Marissa.
Great. EY team, I'm going to kick things over to you just to begin our presentation. Again, for folks in the audience, please feel free to submit those questions as we're speaking. As Lisa said, we'll try to get to as many as we can. If there's any questions that we aren't able to ask, we're happy to answer them in follow-up. So EY team, I'll hand things over to you.
Yeah, many thanks, Marissa. I mean, the plan is that we have like a half an hour's presentation from our side. You can put in the questions that then Marissa and Lisa will facilitate. So just to provide the broad overview, and maybe we're able to also go back to some of those slides when we actually discuss about it. So what is the EUDR about? I guess most of you know because you're joining this webcast. Basically, any kind of import or export or introducing into the European market would be a triggering activity. We have some special cases where, for example, also countries like Liechtenstein are considering to implement the EUDR. They're not part of the customs union, and therefore there's going to be probably different applicability triggers, but that's the basic concept. If we look on the left side, what we're looking for is a deforestation-free commodity that we have listed here in the middle to be imported or exported out of the European market. And what we usually mention is be careful with the word deforestation-free because here the cutoff date you see is 31st December 2020. It doesn't mean that the product really needs to come from deforestation-free land. It's just this cutoff date. And whenever you have like own ambitions that go beyond that, you can communicate that differently, or you should be careful actually putting out that statement. I think we would recommend to be EUDR compliant. That's already a big challenge for the companies. When it comes to the legality piece, that's the second bullet we have on the side. We're going to deep dive on that one because it is a particular challenge for the companies to be in compliance with all the laws of the country of origin. So in the end, what makes this regulation a bit different and a bit with more teeth than others is the requirement to actually put out a public statement that you think that the risks involved in a certain commodity being deforestation-free and to be in line with, for example, human rights laws is negligible. So you're actually up for a public statement that this is the case. So it means you really own your supply chain and you can try to delegate that task to others. But from a legal point of view, if you are the importer of record, then you will have this legal obligation. So below, what are the consequences of non-compliance? And that's also quite specific to EUDR, right? So we see the percentage of turnover, something that is becoming common practice when it comes to supply chain related laws. We also see that in CSDDD, the European supply chain directive that is coming up. And that means we have more attention from the boards, more attention from the ExCos that they actually put in compliance management processes to comply with such regulations. So obviously, who is impacted? The question in the middle, that's basically if your business model has exposure to the commodities that are listed here, you should do the thorough impact analysis and really check whether you have a role in this compliance regulation and whether you're actually impacted. So when we have projects, who is typically involved in those projects? We see that this is a cross service line exercise. That's also why we as EY basically team up cross service line, but we see the same thing happening at our clients. So we have the procurement function, the sustainability function, legal and compliance, and then even risk management being involved in these type of projects. And then what's the timeline and by when does it apply? Well, there's a short timeline to actually fulfill the compliance requirements if everything comes as foreseen. So it's already in place, but we hear a lot of clients that are debating, is it really coming this way? Yes or no? There's an implementation guidance pending. There's an information access platform that's not running yet. So we get a feedback from our clients that they think it might not be coming right away. But basically, the regulation is in place. There are delays when it comes to putting out new Green Deal documents, also based on the elections that happened. And there may be delays until these risk management guidelines come out in a final form. But the concept is actually clear. And also to manage expectations on what will be in this implementation guidance. It's basically cannot go beyond what you already have in the framework concept. So you can tackle this at the moment, although there are lots of open questions. Let me proceed with then the legality topic, exactly on the next slide, on the due diligence requirements. So I mentioned there's these two blocks on the left side, so the deforestation free, and think about actually tracing to the very end, to the origination, you know, where does the coffee bean come from? Where is the commodity that we listed on the previous slide? Where is it actually coming from? And how do I get that information? I basically have to map my supply chain. And then all the legality topics listed on the left side. So this is basically a summary of what the regulation looks for. And it is very, very broad. So you see land use rights, labor rights, third-party rights. Now, when it comes to implementing that into at our clients, the very operational part is the green part, so the deforestation free. How can I map? How do I get the basic information? Who was the farmer actually involved with the coffee bean or with the cocoa? And then when it comes to the legality piece, this is a bit more vague, and it's also not information that you will probably make available to the public. But you need to have a strong system in place to get your house in order, we call it, to make sure that within the supply chain that you own, that you have those topics under control. It will always be a risk-based approach. And this is basically where we see also our clients struggling because they get nervous about the public statement, right? And then how do you go through this checklist? Where are my risks lying? What kind of evidence and documentation do I need in the end? I think the participants will receive the slides in the end. We're not going to go through everything. We just want to set the scene also for the discussion afterwards. But when it comes to the legality piece, I think this regulation is about deforestation free, about being deforestation free. So I think also the due diligence related duties that refer to this specific topic will be high priority when it comes to implementation, and also the human rights part. So if you think about how is this then going to be monitored? We will hear about an information system, so where you actually upload the due diligence statement, and this is somehow an easy check. You can say, where does it come from, and is there any specific deforestation risks related to the address of the commodity? So that's the question that's going to be answered relatively easy. And then if a customs authority, with the help of just the respective authorities that then are going to be responsible, will do an audit, they will look at the get your house in order part, the legality part. What is your framework about it? Do you have a compliance management system in place? Do you have like your 3 lines of defense model, where your internal audit has a role to play, where risk control and compliance have a role to play, and where procurement is actually instructed to ask for the right set of data to come to a conclusion, as we mentioned, on this negligible risks involved in the import to the European market. So on the next slide, having a discussion on who's actually involved and how do you solve these issues. So we have seen different departments pushing for it. It popped up at different departments, but they all need to talk to each other. So obviously the procurement and operations functions is the first line. They need to know what type of data they need to get. They need to know how to actually map the supply chain in order to gather all the relevant information for the risk assessment. And quite often the sustainability team was also a driver on it. The sustainability team is not so used to the compliance topics, so they have their view on what are the sustainability topics involved, and now they somehow get involved in a typical compliance topic. So sustainability team and the compliance function, they need to sort out who's doing what. Typically sustainability team would know about specific risks in the supply chain, and compliance would be rather new to some of those topics. Let me end with the right side, the management and the board. So they are obviously concerned about how to manage the key risks and how to avoid the fines and disruption of supply chain. So we are in Switzerland a third country, and we have quite nervous clients in the back, because they feel like if we can't demonstrate the EUDR compliance, will we be taken out of a distributor assortment? Will our products not be able to be distributed? How much pushback is there going to be? And with these questions, I hand over to Jeroen to also guide us a little bit through those topics.
Thanks, Stefan. So if you look at this slide, you see actually a really simplified supply chain, especially for the people on the call that actually are in the cocoa or like in the chocolate industry. It's really simplified. But what it eventually says, there are 2 streams. So one stream is how it should be done, and one stream is where we get difficulties with EUDR compliance. And the point that Stefan just made about being able to operate, I think, is the most important one. So by the end of this year, an information system needs to be fed with a due diligence statement. And that needs to be done prior to shipment, because when the goods are actually being imported, for instance, in Amsterdam or Rotterdam Harbor, the Netherlands, you will be having controls, or there will be controls on the due diligence statements, because they needs to be uploaded into the system, and it needs to be also included on shipping documents. So if that's not being done, you get potentially supply chain disruptions. And supply chain disruptions, it all sounds a little bit like, hey, would that actually result in supply chain disruptions? But there are already clear, like actually announcements being made that, hey, if you do not have at least a due diligence statement, that hey, you will get controls and checks, because certain goods, they have a certain classification codes and their systems are being linked. Then the second component is making sure that the information that is on the due diligence statement is accurate and correct. And there you go in step 1, 2, and 3 of the supply chain, whereby on the cocoa farms, you need to get the polygons, you need to get the moment of harvest, you need to get the data that is required based on Annex 2 of the EUDR. But at the same time, you need to prove, and that is more 2 and 3, that your supply chain, and that means that also the subsequent steps, are free of deforestation, which also means that you need to be able to track and trace your products. Because how do you prove that? Otherwise, a product is being harvested at moment 1 and being imported in the Rotterdam harbor in like moment 2. At every single step in the supply chain, you need to be able, at the request of the authorities, because that's not something that needs to be submitted in the due diligence statement. So it's also where I make the point about prioritization. But you need to be able, in every single step of the supply chain, to eventually track and trace. And that is of significant importance because many supply chains are complex. And especially if we talk about wood, paper, cocoa, those are really long and complex supply chains. So you need to have assessments and also traceability in place in order to, first of all, visualize it, but second, also to eventually prove, to a certain extent, that then that product that was actually harvested moment 1 was actually being imported in the Rotterdam harbor in moment 2. And there are industries, especially the pharma industry, that already have long time actually experience here, because they have been already tracking and tracing products, at least best traceability, based on their specific requirements. For the rest, what we see on this slide is like the different levels of obligations. And we will talk about that a little bit more in detail on operator versus a downstream operator versus eventually a trader. And then there's a difference between being an SME and being non-SME. Operator, that's the entity that is actually importer of record or exporter of record, or is putting for the first time a good on the European market. So also goods like actually originating in Europe that actually being shipped from location A to B, that could be actually first time being placed on the market. So those are what we always, between brackets, say, hey, those are the taxable moments, because there's a transaction either intercompany or between external parties, whereby there's also a customs-related component, being importer/exporter of record. So there you are the primary obligation holder of like all the points that I just mentioned. The downstream operator, we call that because you will see that in Appendix 1 and the commodities in scope, it's not only raw materials, but also sometimes semi-finished goods. So you will see that if you manufacture, for instance, chocolate in Germany, and you use coffee, which is also being on the list, that you actually procure from actually a third party outside the European Union, then you're the operator. Let's say that you then buy all the cocoa beans from another European party, you will be able to, a certain extent, rely on the due diligence reference number, of course, with additional safeguards, and going back to Stefan's 1, 2, and 3 points about what do you need to do to get your house in order. But you will rely on the due diligence statement of the operator of the chocolate that you procured in Europe. And then the downstream operator combines that due diligence statement, for which it's just a reference, plus it needs to submit the polygons and the moments of harvest for then the coffee that it procures from the third party outside Europe. Now, you already will see that then with the trader down the line is that purely relying on all of the above aforementioned activities of the operators. So there it's more a reference to existing due diligence in combination, of course, with your own risk assessment and risk mitigation activities. So it's not that you just can rely on a due diligence reference number, but you have to do more. You also need to make sure that you do sanity checks. You need to assess eventually the operator's risk assessment and risk methodology approach and processes in order to be able to also make the statement that you're actually trading then products that are free of deforestation and free of like the legality items that Stefan also mentioned. So if we move to the next slide, it's a really simple slide, but what we eventually see most companies still struggling with is especially the component of having non-European entities in the chain. Stefan just referred to Liechtenstein because hey, that is part of like somehow Europe, but it's not part of the customs union because it's sharing customs border with Switzerland. So how to deal with like actually transactions between those locations, or what about UK or Switzerland, as Stefan referred to? Can you be actually an operator? And there are different views still in the market, whereby some people say that based on Article 7, an operator can only be the next legal entity in the chain. We all have seen also legal guidance from the European Commission, whereby they also want to potentially give two operators the elements there, or the primary responsibility for being eventually EUDR operator. It could be then the next legal entity in the supply chain being a European entity, plus, let's say, the non-European entity. And it all depends eventually on how do you transact and how do you operate. So it goes back to who is importer of record, who is exporter of record, what are the customs arrangements? Are things in bond? Are things not being in bond? Do we have a customs broker? And that will eventually determine where's the obligation for EUDR purposes. Now, we see many companies, and that is also something we actively discussing with our clients, whether we need to make changes to actually the transactional model. And that can be sometimes being pushed on suppliers, saying, look, I don't want to be responsible for a full supply chain because I'm only using some, like actually in my example just now, some coffee components. So from that perspective, I don't see that as a core product or core like element within my value proposition as a company. So in that regard, I push that out to my supplier and force them to be eventually importer of record by changing, for instance, the Incoterms and the way you operate and deal and transact with your customers. Again, it will not like actually help you totally eliminating the EUDR obligations, but it helps you with some actually elements in order to determine, hey, where's the primary liability? On the other hand, if you are like actually in the chocolate industry, and then especially looking at the cocoa supply chain, you may actually want to own that supply chain and being responsible for it and being able to change all the transactional flows to actually be the primary obligation holder, just to ensure that you can actually control the narrative towards both your suppliers as well as towards your customers. Because that becomes, I think, really important for companies operating with complex supply chains and not having the predominant base in the European Union. There might be an element whereby, your goods will be subject to debate whether they can be better procured from a European-based entity than, for instance, if they are procuring it directly from you, and whereby the obligation is being passed on the supply chain. I think with that, maybe Alberto, it would be good if you walk us a little bit through the logical steps. And I already started with, I think, the main step, and that is mapping of the supply chain. But what are the other 6 steps that companies need to look at?
Yeah, thank you, Jeroen. So yeah, based on the experience that we developed, assisting several of our clients on getting themselves ready for EUDR compliance, we developed this very basic framework made of 7 steps, right? Jeroen already tapped into some of the tasks in the first stage, right? So the fundamental identification of source data is required to be taken care of, right? In particular, we look at data from 3 different perspectives. So first of all, the identification of the processing scope based on the requirement of the EUDR regulation, but also the companies within the group. So identifying the companies within the group that essentially have an operator or a trader responsibility. And lastly, we need to look at the suppliers. And again, picking up on what my colleague just mentioned. So if you look at the commodities that are in scope for EUDR, these are typically supply chains that are very complex in nature, multi-tier. And so also so this reflects a little bit, this complexity reflects also on the task that companies need to take care of when it comes to mapping all this layer of the supply chains. Because before now, there were not many regulations and that required such a detailed mapping of the end-to-end value chain. So more frequently than not, the supply chain players and different tiers are not clearly established. Right? This is a particularly or an even bigger challenge for organizations that have decentralized purchasing functions, because decentralized purchasing functions frequently reflect into decentralized IT systems that support these purchasing functions. So when you don't have centralized systems, you typically don't have the holistic view on the data that you need for EUDR, right? A significant challenge is also for groups that have multiple subsidiaries that have purchase commodities. Comes also when it goes down to establishing a common baseline of the data, so this holistic view, but also ensuring that the use of CN code, custom codes, are used consistently across all the different purchases, activities that the different subsidiaries in the group perform, right? Because obviously an inconsistent use of CN codes effectively produces an increased risk then of non-compliance. Which is a significant risk, obviously, when you think that local authorities in the EU are required to audit up until 9% of the total import in their respective jurisdictions. As a second step, which might sound obvious to some, is initiate as soon as possible supply outreach campaign. Yeah. For different reasons, but most importantly, in order to gather the information that is required for compliance. Yeah? As I mentioned earlier, so the nature of the supply chain of the commodity and scope of the regulations is typically very complex, and so very frequently our suppliers do not have visibility on their own upstream suppliers. So performing this exercise of mapping can be very complex, is very complex for many of our clients. Hence the strong advice to start this outreach campaign as early as possible. As a third step, we need to evaluate the risks and prioritize the risks that we see in the supply chain based on different criteria. So on the one side, we can look at the track record of our relationship with a particular supplier, or with our track record procuring commodities from specific geographies in the world, right? Where we know that there are typically either there were historically issues around deforestation or human rights as well, or where we have not had problems, but where we know based on indicators that hires the chance to have problems on topics around deforestation and human rights. So that we can sort of target our action, prioritizing on these specific suppliers. The third step is designing and implementing a due diligence platform, and this is where software vendors obviously like Sourcemap can help. Yeah. So the idea is to establish a due diligence process that can help, with the generation of the primary information that go from the geo-localized information on the plot of land where the commodities are sourced from, but also can handle all the document tracking that is involved in collecting information from all the supply chain players that contribute to the delivery of the commodity to us. One thing that we see, several clients working on, and that we're assisting them, is actually on implementing tools to perform the due diligence on the one side, so producing essentially the primary data that is required for the filing of the DDS in line with the EUDR regulation. On the other side, many companies are also involved investing on developing a data platform internally that can collect this data and can help steering some of the consideration about identifying high-risk suppliers and taking actions on those. also trying to sort of establish, the synergy that a regulation like EUDR has with some other regulations. Stefan mentioned earlier CSDDD, so other regulations that aim at tracking supply chain transactions. Once we get this greater, more granular picture on our supply chain, then it's important as a fifth step to start on a potential remediation and renegotiation of supply contracts. This is important, obviously, to ensure that we are granted audit rights on the one side, but also we have critically access and pass on rights over the data, the main information, the data that is required to be collected by our suppliers for the purpose of filing DDS. As a sixth step, we have the development and implementation of risk management system. This needs to be as a broader, more holistic topic that allows us also to integrate, again, picking up on some of the topics that Stefan was mentioning, the legality requirements, for example. So ensuring that we can holistically address the topic, keeping into account also the many local regulations that are applicable in the jurisdictions involved in the supply chain. Last but not least, step 7 is monitor and improve the ongoing due diligence and supplier process. So the idea is to, once we establish this process, operationalize it and improve also like a level of continuous improvement on the process to make the process as efficient, as automated as possible, and improve over time the accuracy of the information that we collect and we use to report upon. And with this, I think we close.
So Alberto, I think you mentioned something really interesting, right? And that is the classification. So almost step 1 and step 2. Was this morning on a call with a client, and we had 6,000 actually commodity codes that they mapped, whereby the client, the customers, because they have shipments going directly into Europe, so they're the importer of record, and sometimes the client is importer of record. So you have 2 different flows with 2 different liabilities. But the customs classification is totally different. So you start already getting into discussions. Hey, what is the basis of actually this import? And we saw that with that specific line, more than 15% of the customs classification was incorrect. And that is not an exception. So that is already the alignment with your suppliers and customers, I think is really important when you start actually having those discussions and alignment, also meetings with your supplier base. So it's not only about obtaining data, but it's also about being on the same page with regard to, hey, do we actually have throughout our supply chain an obligation to report? I think with that, what this slide is doing, it shows, in our eyes, the 7 key important components. And also some lessons learned that we already have seen over the last year and a half, where we start talking about European deforestation rules. And we will probably also, and Marissa coming back to that during the panel, the over-declaration. I think that is something that has been discussed in many industry groups and also on panels previously. Hey, is that actually possible? And I think there's a little bit of a common understanding based on the fact that the frequent asked questions in combination with actually the rule of law, the EUDR regulation, do not say that you need to be 100% accurate on the polygons. You just need to have at least negligible risk of ensuring that products are free of deforestation and harvested and produced in adherence with local and international laws. So you will see that sometimes it will be too costly to be able to track and trace all the polygons to every single import. And then over-declaration could work, but there's a clear element there that forms a risk. Because the moment that you cannot prove throughout your supply chain that you had all the shipments being free of deforestation, and especially with mass balances, that is often slightly different because there's sometimes products of unknown origin. And if you have products of unknown origin, then how can you prove that those are free of deforestation? And that means that you directly put all the products at risk. So yes, theoretically a possibility. However, typically you want to mitigate that risk and ensuring that not all your products are being put at risk by slicing the cake, and making sure that you reduce the risk, at least in the system, or at least make it acceptable, for instance, based on origination, whereby countries with a higher risk based on legality mapping or the non-legality items are then resulting in potentially different shipments. Maybe Stefan, if you want to cover the second one.
Yeah, basically the understanding of your CN codes, I think you already mentioned it, is crucial, and you have customs authorities that have a different interpretation of what an import should be. So what we do with clients, or what we see also that they're reaching out to the customs authority and want to have clarity on whether the actual CN code is in or out of scope. I think we have not mentioned that in detail, but the Appendix 2 that you were referring to, Jeroen, so you have a clear customs identification number, and this is what you can actually map when you have the import data. So, and if you can agree with customs authorities that that you are importing under a code that is not in the appendix of the regulation, then you can scope these type of imports out of the regulation. I think what we have here is basically a summary. Maybe we can leave it. Maybe we can leave the slide and start the discussion. I think we have received some questions already, and Marisa, I know you prepared some for us. Just to remind you of our profiles, I'm kind of the sustainability, compliance, and risk governance guy, if you like. I have an overlapping profile with Jeroen, who's coming from the tax sustainability and operational framework side. And please add whenever I'm missing something. And Alberto is our tech implementation data guy. So this is how we connect the dots within EY. And I guess I think that's an interesting information for you as well, because you will have to map these disciplines when you implement an EUDR project.
Great. Thank you all so much. Before we transition into the questions, I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about what EUDR compliance looks like in practice. I'm going to show a short video that is based on some of the work that Sourcemap has done in the almost 15 years that we've been in this business, and what it has looked like when we've worked with companies on deforestation risk. A lot of this work that we were doing with companies, of course, predates the EUDR entering into force and being adopted as a regulation. But some really key components there that will carry into the actual enforcement period of the law. So I just want to spend a few minutes showing this video, and then we'll open it up to our discussion. So again, as I mentioned, we have many years here in the mapping space, mapping EUDR commodities to origin. These are, of course, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, soy, beef and leather, wood and paper, and rubber. And as our panelists have articulated, some of these commodities can be more complex than others. Of course, most on this call know that in terms of requirements for beef under the regulation, there are some slightly modified requirements compared to the other commodities. And then, of course, with wood and paper, because of the very high risk of mixing within those supply chains, there can be an additional layer of complexity in terms of actually segregating to properly meet EUDR obligations. And we talked a little bit in slides prior about the over-declaration option. We'll talk about that during the Q&A a bit, but just to throw a little wrench in that option based on the specifications that the EU has shared around their API for the information system. It does appear that there still exists a limit on the number of polygons that you can submit with each due diligence statement. That can complicate the over declaration option, which we know a lot of companies are planning on utilizing because of that difficulty around segregation. But right now, it looks like that limit would be around between 5,000 to 10,000 polygons, depending on their size. For those of us with extensive experience already mapping in these industries, we know that an over-declaration option for wood and paper, for cocoa, for coffee, could very easily be much, much higher than 10,000 polygons in terms of the total number of potential plots of land that could have contributed to AA-derived products. So just wanted to sort of raise that, and we'll talk about that a little bit during the Q&A. But a lot of learnings that we at SourceMap have made over the last 12 plus years in this space. So I'm going to transition quickly to this short video, and then again, we'll open things up to our panel. Okay. All right. So wanted to show that quick video again to just demonstrate what experience SourceMap has had in this space, and to sort of articulate the complexity required to really meet the obligations under the deforestation regulation. This slide briefly demonstrates what each of the key requirements of the law are and how SourceMap's functionality meets those requirements. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more as we dive into the panel. But something that I want to really overemphasize before we transition into the panel discussion is based on the sheer volume of data and the speed with which due diligence statements need to be generated in order to meet EUDR obligations. There really is no manual alternative to meeting the requirements of the law. When we're talking about large companies, multinational companies, companies that are importing large volumes of goods into the EU, exporting large volumes of goods out of the EU, and selling goods within the European Union, these are oftentimes an incredibly high number of due diligence statements that would need to be generated very, very quickly. And frankly, with not a lot of turnaround time from when an operator would actually receive all of the information needed to generate the entirety of that due diligence statement, including the quantity of the goods being placed on the market, and when they would actually need to generate that statement. So that's really the role that SourceMap plays. We are helping companies automate this process. We're collecting as much information as we can, as early as possible, to really streamline that process and enable companies to ensure that they have everything prepared and have due diligence statements that they know will clear through customs as they place them on the market. So I don't want to spend too much time on the slide, but I just want to quickly walk through each of these requirements. Of course, there is the critical component of the law, collecting those polygons and or due diligence reference numbers in the case of a trader for each shipment. So in Sourcemap's platform, a request is sent via Sourcemap supplier portal to collect those polygons and or those due diligence reference numbers for in-scope shipments. I know we talked about this a little bit in earlier slides here, but the due diligence reference numbers, the need to collect those for traders can be somewhat complicated. There are oftentimes more than one operator within a supply chain, and the trader role can be a little bit complicated when one, you know that the collection of those polygons is not necessarily something that you as a trader have ownership over, have power over, but that the liability in the event that information is inaccurate, that 4% fine can be a shared liability across operators and non-SME traders in the supply chain. So there is a degree of risk for traders that are collecting those due diligence reference numbers and referencing polygons that have already been submitted and cleared through the market. The polygon data needs to be validated and formatted for quality assurance. As Stefan mentioned, the EU is planning on publishing its implementation guidance, its official implementation guidance in the coming weeks. We have seen draft versions of that guidance. We've also seen API specifications for the EUDR information system. While, of course, as we've mentioned, there's a lot that remains to be done on that front. But it is important that your polygons are in the right format and also are accurate. You don't want a farmer submitting a polygon that is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, for example. If you haven't checked whether your polygons are actually plausible and accurate, that can represent a potentially large amount of risk and risk that your due diligence statements might be rejected. In Sourcemap's platform, we're able to validate the polygons based on those specifications that the EU has circulated. So that, to give our customers that peace of mind that the polygons that they are submitting and attaching to their due diligence statements are accurate. And then the deforestation risk piece, the critical piece of the law, the purpose of the deforestation regulation. We are conducting deforestation analysis on all of those uploaded polygons. That's happening automatically. That's happening very quickly. And we're able to run that analysis against multiple data sets. Of course, the preliminary data set that we will always run polygons against is the EU's data set, the Global Forest Observatory. Of course, there are some concerns with that data set, but it is the data set that the EU has circulated and that the EU is using. We are also able to conduct that analysis against more detailed data sets, such as Copernicus and others. And then we're able to alert our customers in our platform whether deforestation risk is identified. And so they're able to get that information as soon as possible, as early as possible, in order to really know whether or not a due diligence statement has a risk of deforestation and a risk of not being admitted into the EU. And then the connection with the EU's information system. That is a really critical component of automation between our platform and the information system. As we've mentioned, as our fellow panelists have mentioned here, the EU's timeline for allowing operators and authorized representatives into the information system is very close to when the EUDR enters into force. Right now, the timeline that was articulated during the stakeholder meeting that took place on June 20th is that essentially training videos will be sent in the next month, 2 months, to show operators and authorized representatives how to get into the system. However, the actual access to get into the information system, to be able to create due diligence statements, will happen between November and December. So again, this is a very short turnaround time to that December 30th enforcement of the law. Not a tremendous amount of time to prepare, frankly, for companies. But it's of course something that we're tracking and monitoring very closely. And then finally, the legality piece. I know we'll talk about this with our panelists as we transition into the Q&A portion. But from our perspective at Sourcemap, the legality risk is fairly complex. This is or the EU is recommending a flexible approach to legality. There are 7 categories of legal risk that are noted in the draft implementation guidance that the EU recommends that companies look at. However, legality is something that should be incorporated into a company's existing due diligence system. So that can include things like audits. It can include things like site visits. It can also include things like surveys to your suppliers, with, of course, the enormous caveat that, collecting surveys, just collecting survey data and documents cannot guarantee that all aspects of legality have been met, of course. There are so many potential risks when you look at all of the broad categories that the EU recommends that companies look at. And so that's really where audits and a more detailed look into that aspect of compliance is really necessary. So I'm going to open things up to our panel discussion here. I know we have a lot to cover and really excited to dive into the discussion with our panelists. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Lisa to kick off the panel.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So one thing I wanted to touch on is, as we know, the EUDR covers soy, wood, beef, cocoa, coffee, palm oil, rubber, and all their derived products listed in the annex of the regulation. One thing we talk about here at Sourcemap is kind of our experience in this area, especially with cocoa. But I do want to ask the panel, do you believe all of these industries are at equivalent levels of maturity in terms of their ability to map and share all this information, their ability to map their upstream supply chains? And how would you encourage your clients to think about that? I don't know if Marissa or...
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then would love to hear from our EY panelists. It has really been interesting seeing companies and industries rush to prepare themselves for the EU deforestation regulation. They are not all at equivalent levels of maturity based on a long history in industries like cocoa and coffee, where deforestation risk has been something that they've been thinking about for a while. There are companies that we've worked with in those industries that have made public commitments to deforestation-free chocolate or deforestation-free coffee, for example. And so that has allowed them to get a little bit of a head start compared to some of these industries that don't have the same experience here. And in those more experienced industries, they've already gone through the process of collecting polygons. They've already gone through the process of identifying or working with companies like Sourcemap to identify which deforestation risk data sets they want to map their polygons against. This is something I will say, just to reference another law that we're following very closely and work with a lot of customers on at Sourcemap. The US forced labor regulation that's currently on the books kind of had a similar transition period and on-ramping period for certain industries. That is a more broad sweeping legislation compared to the EUDR because it's not specific to certain commodities or products. But the US was focused on certain industries and certain areas when the law went into effect. One of them was apparel and textiles. Those of us who've worked in mapping for a long period of time know that apparel and textiles have dealt with issues around forced labor and child labor in their supply chains for quite a long time. And so they were a little bit more prepared than some of the other industries that were heavily impacted by the US forced labor regulation. But what I can say we've seen over the last 2 years from that law going into effect is when there is a regulatory requirement around mapping, around risk analysis, risk assessment, industries get up to speed very, very quickly, because they have to. But this does show that some of the industries that were leaders in this space do have a little bit of an advantage in terms of their ability to comply and their ability to on-ramp their supply chains very rapidly, and their relationships with their suppliers, which is a critical piece as well.
I'm also happy to add from, I think, the EY side. And in the meantime, I think I figured out how to get out of all my notifications, because that was like a couple of pop-ups. So really short, I think that it really depends on the specific supply chain of a corporation. And already their commitments, as you mentioned, Marissa, for the past. So you have, of course, naturally, that's whereby supply chains are more complicated. I mean, the wood, paper, but also the cocoa industry, I think they have just more complex supply chains than maybe if you compare that to rubber, also just from a geographical perspective and where goods are originating from. If you take that together with already the commitments and, for instance, existing legislation, you mentioned the US legislation, we have in Europe, we have, of course, the German Supply Chain Act, we had for timber, we also had the EUDR, so the predecessor of like actually EUDR, whereby there already were some requirements in order to actually be compliant and think about, hey, where our goods are originating from. I think the complexity level eventually is so important for them, and that what you mentioned about supply chain mapping, I think if you really look at the most struggles companies currently having is to get like full visibility on their end-to-end supply chain, because typically they have maybe to tier one, but hey, this new rules and new legislation also require you to actually look further down into your supply chain and get visibility there, because eventually you need to be, when you import, being able to actually make that statement that this is free of deforestation, that the products are indeed like produced at that specific moment and then imported at that other moment. So that additional level of mapping and also the exceptions that typically are there based on whatever business operational preferences or safety stock that, for instance, are needed, you see that companies have difficulties to get actually their ducks in a row. So yes, I fully agree with you, Marissa, with your statement that this cannot be a manual exercise. This needs to be automated, because otherwise it's impossible to actually be compliant. But there's like a quite hefty journey actually on its way, because what most of the time companies are doing, they look at historic data, which is quite logical because you have potentially HS codes for certain like actually imports and exports. And you know, maybe with Interstat data, that you have certain like European transactions that are in scope. But it doesn't mean that next week, and especially Alberto mentioned that if you have a decentralized procurement setup, the next week there will be no new or other actually procurement activities happening. So also there, it already starts with processes, governance and controls to bring that back to at least a situation whereby you have the house in order.
Maybe adding on the maturity part of companies, one thing is the sector that we already covered. You know, some sectors are just known to do the supply chain tracing based on events or on regulations, pharma, for example, or but what we also see is that in some projects, companies have accepted responsibility for a certain part of their supply chain. So be it cocoa, coffee, or cattle, because it's kind of part of their key product, and they have good control over the risks involved. Doesn't mean that they're already EUDR compliant, but they have a feeling about the risks involved in the supply chain. But the regulation goes further, and especially in the case of palm oil, which is not, the core and is added to products, or when it comes to packaging material that you're buying, we see that companies are often not aware that they are impacted by EUDR. And here I would say they also don't have they are not really mature about these processes, because they tend to just rely on the supplier.
Thanks, everyone. So just to build on that, when we've talked a little bit about this already, but throughout the entire polygon collection process, throughout this entire process, companies are going to be relying on the information submitted by their suppliers, but they're also going to be retaining liability if that information is inaccurate. So speaking through technology and kind of relationship building, how important is supplier and customer communication when collecting this EUDR information? Alberto, I'd love to get your opinion on this first. Oh, you're muted. Alberto?
And he is our IT guy, right? That's no. So let me jump into it. I think it's super important, but indeed, let's distinguish the primary versus the secondary obligation. So primary, really, where you're the operator, and where you need to collect the data, where you need to prove that traceability item, where you need to map the supply chain. I think there's a heavy lifting that needs to be done. And then the secondary, where you are like, for instance, trader or downstream operator, what I tried to explain previously, whereby you still have the obligation actually to be EUDR compliant, but you are not the primary responsible entity in the chain. So you can do that in a different way. And I think most companies will also start looking, hey, what is my prioritization in tackling the EUDR requirements? And I already mentioned that previously, that being able to submit that due diligence reference number is quite key to avoid supply chain disruptions. We do not expect that the authorities stop every single good at the 1st of January 2025. But if you're not able to at least make that submission of that statement, then you may actually see that supply chain disruption. So when you're a primary obligation holder, so meaning the operator, you need to make sure that you have that under control. But when you're a trader and you're dependent on the operator to do the right things, I mean, I'm coming back to that point about supplier communication, Lisa, your question. It's super critical to understand the level of maturity of your supplier, because if they are not able and capable of actually submitting that, like the diligence statement, and they have issues in their supply chain, then it's not only their problem, but it becomes your problem as well. So I think that is one piece. The second piece was the customer side. And when I also intervened when Alberto was explaining a little bit our 7-step approach, I gave that example that the HS classification codes are not totally the same for every single company, because there was not always the right emphasis being put on. So there, to have that communication towards your customer and also understand, hey, how they see their obligation and what they expect and what they are going to actually publish in there, for instance, their statement, the CSRD statement, for instance, or like on the website, I think is really important. And then also for them, for you to provide them with some form of comfort that you have all the ducks in a row, and that they do not start looking at supplier diversification for your products based on the fact that they don't think that you have your house in order. So for me, really important supplier and customer communication based on ensuring that you mitigate impacts both at the customer as well as the supply side.
Great. Alberto, anything to add to that?
Sorry, I wasn't unable to unmute anymore. I had to log in back in the call. But no, I think Jeroen probably covered already all the elements. I don't have much to add on this specific point. Thanks.
Okay, great. So moving on, I think companies on the other piece of this seem to have a lot of questions about that legality component of the law. So this requires operators to comply with all of the relevant local and regional laws in the countries from which they source the in-scope commodities. So what can you all tell us about the legality requirements under the law? Stefan, I'm wondering if you want to take that one first.
Yeah, legality can be endless to start with. You know, how do you make sure that you have all laws under control of all the countries you have in place? But obviously it starts also with engaging with the supply chain. So basically asking for confirmations for information. And then the question is really, what is good enough? So it's a risk assessment. And basically we hear, you know, if you are going back to source countries, sometimes in Africa or Asia, you will not have a clear answer on land use rights. So these are kind of practical topics, and what is actually acceptable as information, as documentation, when it comes to these topics. And I think we're asked whether we have the perfect solution for that. And I would say in development stage, right? So basically, you need a lot of benchmark information. And we also hear the pressure to have this harmonized risk assessment, but we have to disappoint our clients in this regard, because it is up to everybody's own judgment to say, you know, what is negligible risks or not. What you can get is standardized information. What you can get is benchmark information on the legality topics that I mentioned. You know, what are the labor rights in the country? What are the land use rights in the country? What is an acceptable documentation? In Switzerland, I want to refer to the official registry, whereas in Côte d'Ivoire, I will get my polygon data. I will want to have some validity checks. I mean, Marisa was mentioning some checks that you can do on whether it's in the ocean, right? So that's kind of a first pragmatic check, but is it overall reliable information that you're getting? And then you really rely also on local help to actually make this information better. So nothing will refrain from actually knowing your supply chain and getting really trusted data. Has also to do with knowing what happens at the locations.
Great, thanks. So one more question for me, and then I'm going to start pulling from the Q&A. Of course, the main objective of the law is to prohibit goods contributing to deforestation from being placed on or made available on the EU market. So what can you tell us about the types of deforestation data sets that are out there, and what data set the EU will be referencing? I know, Marisa, you started to speak about this in your section. I'd love to hear from you first.
Great. Yeah, so as I mentioned, the EU had published its Global Forest Observatory data set last year. Any companies that have perhaps pre-screened their polygons against that data set are likely aware that it does yield pretty high hits against polygons, and sometimes those results may be inconsistent with other data sets. So there's a potential risk of overflagging with the Global Forest Observatory data. That's not entirely unexpected, just given what that data set looks like, and the fact that it is not as granular as some other deforestation analysis as well. But a recommendation that we do make to companies that are perhaps concerned about the potential for overflagging against that data set is, first, it's important to identify other more granular data sets, such as Copernicus Sentinel-2. There are a lot of different options for satellite deforestation data sets out there. But when you are experiencing a polygon that perhaps is yielding a different result against the EU's data set compared to some of these more granular data sets, it is important to prepare for the possibility of an audit by the EU. So we talked a little bit about those 9% audits by each of the member states within the EU from goods that are originating from high-risk countries. It is inevitable that you may have a due diligence statement that might yield a flag against or a partial flag against the Global Forest Observatory data set, and perhaps not have the same result against Copernicus Sentinel-2. And then it obviously gets a little bit complex. We know that the Global Forest Observatory data set is a data set that the EU is looking at. They have made very clear that they're not going to explicitly recommend specific data sets. In their last round of FAQs, they made this very clear. But ensuring that you have all of the evidentiary data that, for example, this polygon should not be flagged as having high deforestation risk because it has been analyzed against some of these more granular data sets, is a really important piece of the puzzle in terms of EUDR compliance. And that's really a value add, I will say, that SourceMap is able to provide because we are doing all of this in a singular platform. We're able to collect all of that corroborating data to prepare you. Of course, we don't want our customers to undergo an audit from the EU, but we don't have control over that. And so the more information, the more prepared you are for that possibility, the more successful you will be as a company.
Perfect. So jumping into the Q&A, I know we started a couple minutes late, so I do want to get to these. Is the FSC certification for rubber considered sufficient for compliance and as a sign of chain of custody traceability? I don't know if someone from the EY team wants to start.
The simple answer is no, right? I think there's no certification schemes that provide one-on-one, like actually EUDR compliance. And we know that certain certification schemes are busy to make it EUDR aligned. But currently, there's no such certification scheme already fully up and running. I think it helps when you have certification schemes. Not all certification schemes are equal, but it definitely helps in your risk assessment and your risk mitigation process.
Yeah, I also would same answer. No, helps your risk mitigation process to get your house in order. These certification schemes, there are many out there that deal with EUDR compliance. They also deal with upcoming regulation on greenwashing. They want to make sure that they have sound systems around what they promise to our clients. But in the end, I think you need to reach out to the certification scheme, find out what exactly they are aiming at, whether they are dealing with the topic. They won't solve the issue for you. Something I wish that we hear from clients, but it won't be the case.
Yep, absolutely. So another one from the audience is related to DDS reference numbers, the DDRs. Can you use a DDS reference number on multiple customs declarations, or does it need to be unique for each export of the same product, i.e. send the same batch of a product over multiple shipments? Jerome, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, so it will depend a little bit on the specific question, but likely you cannot, right? Because on every single shipment, you need to upload like actually the reference number, and it has then the specific polygons and the specific like actually moment of harvest data that is required based on Annex 2. So I don't see how you can use like actually a similar reference numbers for similar shipments. But it might be that there's some overlap in a unique case that we could discuss, but I don't see it in practical terms.
Yeah, to say the same thing in different words, I mean, basically, the DD statement is transactional and it needs to be uploaded by each transaction. That's the unique part about it. And we heard from Marissa, that you can collect information for a DD statement, which will remain maybe 90% the same. That's kind of the operational way of how you deal with the DD statements, but you'll have to shoot in every transaction.
Yeah, your static and your dynamic data, right? Whereby static is like your basic data that you have as a basis, and your dynamic data that will change every single shipment. So yeah.
Absolutely. What I will just add to this is, of course, there will be multiple due diligence statements that perhaps have the same polygons attached to them, because of course, you can have a very large harvest, quite a lot of imported commodities or derived products coming from that polygon. But as my fellow panelists have said, the due diligence statements are specific to the shipments. And so there isn't a scenario where you would be copying over exactly the same information over and over and over again, because again, that harvest date is important. The ship and destination is important as well. And some of an issue that some of the companies that we work with have also raised is Again, preparing for a potential audit, making sure that there's some plausibility of harvest analysis happening as well. If you are opting for example, a declaration in excess option, and you are using the same polygons over and over and over again, there is a risk of plausibility of harvest if that has not occurred, that you're submitting due diligence statements for a higher volume of goods that could have reasonably come from the plots of land that you are attaching to your due diligence statement. So that's another component, again, that really comes into play in an audit. That's not something necessarily that's being checked every time a due diligence statement is submitted, because that requires fairly complex analysis on the part of the EU and on the part of the member states that are accepting those due diligence statements. But something to consider for companies that really want to be as accurate as possible and ensure that they are, again, prepared for whatever these audits ultimately look like. We do a lot of speculating about how detailed these audits might be. I think it's important to just acknowledge the practical limitations on auditing. That 9% is a really high number of due diligence statements, and it does potentially place a disproportionate burden on certain member states that are going to have a higher volume of imports coming from high-risk countries, just a higher volume of imports, period, or products placed on the market. And so it remains to be seen how detailed those audits actually look in practice versus in theory. But my stance is you can never be over-prepared. It's important to really take a complete look at risk until we know exactly what these look like.
Depending on the cost, it's a potential business case for us. Who's going to bear the costs of the audit? And I think that's going to be member state by member state. But there's a risk that you will have to pay for the audit, and it might not be customs authorities conducting it. If you hear the high number of 9%, they probably will reach out to a supplier as us who know how to do audits, and therefore we also have an expectation on risk-based approaches. And in the end, you don't own success, you own best effort, right? In these supply chain due diligence related regulations. And it comes back to this, get your house in order. So what did you do to actually try to find out? The more you can demonstrate on that side, the lesser the fee is that you are risking.
And I think, Stefan, to add to that, I mean, we can probably only expect when we have those audits that you want to be fast and quick, right? So when you get, because the due diligence reference numbers, probably everything goes through, but if you get indeed an audit, how do you respond to it? So your whole risk assessment and risk mitigation approach, you need to write that down and be able to also communicate that directly towards like actually any authority that audits you. And I think that is where most companies are not yet thinking, because they're still in the early steps of being EUDR compliant. But that's one for me to actually put a little bit higher on the priority list, because you want to avoid that whatever is happening, that your goods are like actually staying for an unnecessary period of time in a port or in harbor somewhere in the world.
Great, thanks guys. So I'm gonna jump into a couple related to the commodities from the Q&A. So one is, if I have a chocolate bar, which is sold under that affected commodity code, but it also contains palm oil, do I need to get geolocations and complete risk assessments for the palm oil and the cocoa? I think anyone on the EY team could jump in on that, but I'll let you all decide.
Yeah, so this is an interesting debate on different point of views in the industry as well. We can go into a really technical analysis based on the current read and also the frequent asked questions, and specifically to certain wording in Article 9 and Article 4. We think that you will be required to, if you have chocolate, to also the commodities that are contained therein, and that's also the explicit wording used, that you also need to report on that. So meaning that if you have a commodity under 1806, which is chocolate, and you then have coffee in there, that you also need to report on that. And that depends, of course, if that's a reference DD or it's the polygons and all the other data components. But that is our current read. We expect more clarity because this was one of the most frequently actually asked questions to the Commission, and there's no clarity on it yet, and they didn't answer in any frequent asked questions on it. And also based on the intel and discussion that we're having, no full clarity yet on it, but also they have different views. But I can only recommend to prepare for the worst, in the sense that I would not wait until the end of the year and say, hey, look, I take this point of view, which may, at the end of the day, may be the accurate one if we have released a new guidance or new implementation guidance. But I would prepare for it and at least understand, hey, how is that supply chain within the palm oil or in the coffee then? How is that looking?
And I think it's fair to say that the chocolate industry faces the highest challenges probably when it comes to EUDR, because if you look at the appendix, you see that many of the commodities are just pure commodities. But in the case of chocolate, we're talking about the finished products that includes all those EUDR relevant products. So I guess that's the reason why you have in the regulation the requirement to trace everything, but in the case of a finished product like chocolate, it becomes very, very cumbersome. And if you also compare the rest of the finished products like furniture, it's not as complex because the tree of a furniture might come from the same area, and it has by no means the same complexity of the supply chain if you have to trace the palm oil that goes into chocolate, or if you have to trace maybe coffee that goes into chocolate. There was also a question on rubber and packaging. So basically they are, so a tire of a car is a car would be a finished product, but there you don't have the import of rubber, even though if you think about practically, there is an import of rubber. And that's just the fairness or the unfairness of the regulation. And these are a lot of the questions that we also have with clients. So it goes back to, are you on the catalog of these CN codes in the end?
Great. Yes, I'm still seeing the questions rolling in. I think there's one right now about composite product as well. How are we expected to trace MDF, for example? Stefan, do you want to take that one?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
What about composite products? How are we expected to trace MDF, for example?
I think that refers to what Jeroen was mentioning, whether if you composite an EUDR product with another EUDR product, which then becomes a new customs tariff number, do you have to trace both? And our view is, yes, you do, because based on the regulation, how it is written. But we hear the industry complaining because they say it's not fair and you have to do all these in-house traceability. It's just practically almost impossible. And that leads to the solution that we have teased basically, on this over-declaration. So basically, you refer to one supply chain of one composite of the product and then to the other on the other composite of the product. And you just say, maybe I don't know how these things have been mixed, but I can over-declare that it's coming from Ghana, Indonesia, Europe, wherever, and you can do an audit on it, and you will find no surprises. That's kind of the concept of the over-declaration.
And I think to add to that, so if you read the rule of law and also the frequent asked questions has been currently published, I think there is no other read that if you cannot actually prove and you're not able to track and trace and you don't have visibility of your supply chain, that you should not actually import the product into the European Union. So if the specific product is in scope, then you need to really think about your supply chain setup and how you actually source. What are the steps within the supply chain? Where do you actually have a mixing place? Where do you have actually loading place? And ensure that there's some form of risk assessment and risk mitigation process being done. Some people use scanners, bar scanning technology The other is to make sure that there's no mass balance, for instance. But yes, also the wood industry, especially when we start to talk about composite products, I mean, that's really difficult because it's really difficult to, I mean, a piece of paper, right? I mean, it can come from hundreds and thousands of trees because it's often being mixed. So that's the complication, whereby you need to really try to be really strong on other components, such as supplier selection, supplier like risk assessment, supplier also onboarding, but also when do you actually make sure that you terminate certain contracts, because the tracking and tracing is just becoming a little bit more difficult than probably the risk assessment and the risk mitigation process.
Great. Yeah, I think yeah, that's been a hot topic as well. So I think for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of jump to one last question here from the Q&A on the technology part, and then we'll wrap up. There are several great questions still in the chat. So we'll plan to either do a written follow-up and or possibly some shorter or more specific follow-up webinars with this group on some of the detailed topics. But the last one here for Marissa is, can you confirm if the SourceMap platform can send the due diligence data to the EUIS or traces, even without validating the documents for the documentations for legality, but only validating the polygon of the raw material origin?
Yeah, that's a great question. The answer is yes. We've definitely had customers or companies that we're working with flag that, and of course we're aware of this as well. There is an attestation on the due diligence statement that essentially says whoever's submitting the due diligence statement can attest that all aspects of the deforestation regulation have been met, and that this is a compliant due diligence statement. However, as we've talked about throughout this webinar, the legality component is very complex. It's something that companies should be incorporating into their existing due diligence process, their audit process. And that is something that, companies that are attempting to really prepare before the regulation goes into effect are starting to do now, so that they're able to incorporate that due diligence, or incorporate that legality, those legality components into their due diligence process. However, when you're submitting a due diligence statement, you are not attaching some audit report on the details of exactly what you have done to meet the legality obligations of the law. That means that you're submitting a due diligence statement, all of that additional documentation is not included. So the short answer to the question is absolutely yes. We are prioritizing the main component of the law, which is, again, the deforestation risk. You cannot submit a due diligence statement that is compliant if the deforestation aspect is non-compliant, if you don't have acceptable polygons. Those are really the essential components of the law, and that is what needs to be in every due diligence statement. Of course, the legality component is very important as well, but that is a separate due diligence process, and a more complex one that is continuous, and one that, again, we recommend companies incorporate into their existing processes.
Okay, great. Thanks again to the EY team and Marissa as well. Really appreciate all the time. For those of you who still had some questions that we weren't able to answer, again, we will find a number of ways to get those out. I think, as all of the panelists have mentioned, this is an evolving situation. There's still a lot we're learning, and I think there will be a lot more to learn between now and the end of December. But thanks all for the time. And we'll send some follow-up as well after this meeting. Have a great day, everyone.